the code is that we're looking at. We can see settings there. We can take a look at different pins if we'd like. This is where it should be different if you're looking at a mini or a classic. It should match its image there. And then we have code examples. So this is where we're going to work from first. So the numerically inclined among you may notice that we're under 00 Soundstack. We start off at number 5, and we just left number 4 from inside of PD. So if we click on 5, it's going to load up a different image for you here, a pretty simple looking patch. Anyone having difficulties?
Yeah. I think it should be alright. It's just patch to begin with.
Oh, okay.
So I was a bit like, what's going on?
That's fine. And everyone else sees this, right? Like a pot. It doesn't matter. Any 2 analog actually would be fine. So what this is going to do is it's going to be, so we have our analog inputs, which we haven't seen yet, we haven't used yet, because these are now objects, abstractions in PD that only make sense for working with the board itself. If you want to dig into them, they're inside the folder of the downloads that you've already downloaded from that repository. And then scope, one of the really cool things about Bela is it has a built-in oscilloscope in the browser. So what this is doing is it's just taking what the first 2 analog inputs are and then going to pipe it into the scope so we can see their values there. So in order to do that, we need to run the patch. So first we're going to do this, and we'll pass out some sensors, but we'll first do this without anything plugged in, and we'll just see noise signals. So we're not going to see anything of interest. It's just going to be some noise, but that's then we'll add in some sensors here. So we have, to run it, we have this little arrow, kind of, it looks just like the refresh. And so if you're ever like working too much in this environment and you get tired, you start hitting refresh instead of run. I do that all the time. Nothing bad will happen. If you refresh the page, it's okay. But run, if you click on run, then we start seeing these things printing out. It's building, it's running, it prints a bunch of stuff, and then it just says it's running, and it tells us what the CPU load is. We then can also, this little squiggly line icon, we can click on that. If we hover on it, it says open scope. If we click on it, it opens a new tab. And we have just to kind of, this will look slightly different for everyone depending on various things happening on the board. But so you can see the oscilloscope. So what we're going to do is pass out quickly some sensors. If you have, so actually, if you have a Bela Classic, if you will, you're actually, what's the best way? No, that's not set. Sorry, just realized I didn't put into the slides any of the classic circuit diagrams. So if you go to bela.io, so if you're working with a classic, you're going to go to bela.io and then resources, and then wiki. And then we have some examples, and then I'm just going to put it up for you. So you're going to make something like that if you're working with the classic. If you're working with the Bela Mini, you get to work with paper sensors. So we have our very simple Belascope example here. So all we've done is we have the input and we're going to the scope. We don't have any audio yet. So the audio is going to be number 6. Let's take those same kinds. So there's a couple steps here that you can tune. So this one, So number 6 we see is now more complicated, and we've seen old friends come back to us. So we have our audio file playback, we have our threshold, we have our output. All of these things are the same as what we were working with in pure data. We now see we don't have any more interactive sliders, right? Because we can't manually interact with this. So now when we create our PD patches, we have to think about how they get interacted only via the sensor inputs. And otherwise, everything else needs to have like a load bang associated with it so that it just at start will interact. So you have to think about a mouse-less PD patch when you're doing a PD patch for Bela. So that's why we have tons of load bangs. We don't have our slider anymore for our input. Instead, we have our analog inputs. So everyone just has, at least people with paper sensors, only have one input. We're just working with the one analog input. And then it's working in the same kind of logic as before. So the input comes in. We have this threshold of 0.5. So if the analog input is greater than 0.5, which we could see in the scope, because it goes from 0 up to 1. So here we have 0.5. If the input from my sensor goes above here, then it's going to play the audio. If it falls below it, it will stop the audio from playing. And yeah, so we can go ahead and give that a go and listen to it. So if you will need to make sure you have a cable plugged in. I think everyone does, because I think Robbie was very thorough. So you need to plug in headphones now, because we're not going to be listening to our computers anymore. We're listening to Bela's. So you take your headphones, you plug it in the end of the jack connection that's coming off of Bela. So this is how we can listen to what's coming off of Bela.
And the audio files are also uploaded on the Bela?
Yes. Yeah.
So what's the capacity of the Bela?
It's an SD card. So,
Okay,
so if the Bela Classics are, if you're not using an external SD image, the internal is, I think, 8 gigs. And like the Bela Minis, everything's running off of a micro SD card, and so they're whatever you need.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the second time of the blue one.
Mm-hmm.
Why that's
It's just kind of,
cycling.
it's just picking up kind of stray noise,
Oh, okay.
and it might find that it's quite tied to this.
Mm.
I don't know. This is overly noisy. I don't know. This signal is not great. I don't understand why.
That's better? It was the charger.
It's better.
It was the charger, I think.
Yeah.
If I put
It's
it back
still,
in.
it's still much more than.
Oh.
I'm not so excited by it, but it's working enough.
Yeah, sure.
You know, like it's not a great signal, but at least we can interact with it. So yeah. So.
I don't seem to be getting any audio.
Okay. So what's your scope look like? Let me look at the oscilloscope. Would you mind helping her set up one of the older Belas instead of this? We have some real kind of noise interference issues.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. Okay, so you may or may not have had sounds, and part of this may be because you're not, the thresholds for the patch don't line up with what the thresholds of your sensor are. So, right, we want to be able to change this number, but we can't just put it into edit mode and click and do anything with it here, right? Because we're not actually working with PD, we're working with a screenshot of what the patch would look like. So let's step back and just talk about how we program Bela using PD. Why did you do that? There we go. So what we're doing is actually interacting with a system like this. So the arrow is our USB cable. So we have on our laptop, we can run pure data. On our Bela hardware, whatever Bela we're working with, it's running some C++ code, and that C++ code is calling some code from libpd. So that libpd is able to take our PD patch and interpret it for us to be running on Bela, but this isn't actually pure data. We can edit things in pure data over here. So what we're going to do is take our patches, edit them on the laptop, then copy that file across once it's been edited onto the Bela. So, and that's our workflow. We know this is not the best workflow, but it is at least a workflow to get Pure Data working on an embedded Linux device, which is in itself a big thing. So we're going to go back into PD on our laptops, open up the patch, adjust the threshold as you'd like. So maybe you want it more sensitive, maybe it's always on and you need to make that threshold higher, closer to 1. Then you save it, and then to upload the new patch, actually all you do is take that PD file and drag and drop it on top of the browser window. And it will ask if it's okay to overwrite it, and it will do that. So you already have all of those files downloaded. Bring it back up. So in all of those examples, you'll see it goes on to example number 5 and 6. So this is the exact example we're looking at on Bela. So we can go in, we can edit it. If, for example, if you're not working with 2 sensors, you could go through and you could just delete all of that and just have the 1 sensor if you'd like. If you want to then change this and say, that is way too sensitive, it is constantly on, I want that to be 0.8. Or it's not sensitive enough, it's never turning on the music, I would like that to be 0.2. That's where you can change it. You then can save it, and then drop it and save it, and then you can take that file and drag and drop it right on top of the window, the PD IDE window where you program it. It will ask if you want to overwrite the file. You say, yes, you do. And then you should see your changes happen inside of the Bela window then. Things to note, and you might have noticed this, every one of these are called _main.pd. That needs to be maintained. So even the file has to be called _main.pd in order to actually have Bela know what file to upload. So _main.pd, yeah. So you can have only one _main.pd for any PD project. And it can then call other abstractions and things like that. That's fine, and they can call whatever. But you need to have one file called _main.pd, because that's when we're back and looking at things in this way. Bela is going to look for a file called _main.pd and run that file. If it doesn't see it, it doesn't know what to run. Because you only have a single, because you only have one inside that one project. There we go. Oh. No one's even touched them before. Is anyone else using like iPod or microphone integrated earbuds? Okay, so just so you know, though, if you have a 4-pin connector instead of just a 3-pin tip ring sleeve, other 3-pin things are not very happy with that. So if you don't have headphones working and because they're like Apple headphones, that's why. And we have other headphones to swap out. So of course there's a lot of preamble in order to be able to interact with Bela and just kind of basics of interacting with the platform at all that we've now hopefully covered enough, even if you're still kind of working through these things since things are not absolutely as you would hope. Hopefully at least some amount of familiarity now for how we work with Bela. So now let's talk about not Bela specific things at all. So just to kind of step back and talk about spatial audio, and in particular spatial audio and how we listen to spatial audio. So this giant screen's great, except there's nowhere you can stand without being in front of it. So spatial audio is a collection of things. So I think certainly if you're inside of a place like where we are now, which is a School of Electronic Engineering and Computer Science, then we think a lot about the physical science and then also the perceptual psychology of spatial audio. But I really like this. This is from Blesser and Salter's book, which I really recommend, called Spaces Speak, Are You Listening? And they talk about spatial audio actually having 3 components to it. It being physical science about sound and sound propagation. There's the perceptual psychology, so how our heads interact and the physiology of our bodies interacting and interpreting that spatial audio, that physical sound wave coming to us. But then there's also cultural aspects of it as well, which I think places like engineering schools maybe perhaps forget a little bit about this, but there's a lot about the culture behind how we listen, and that will lead to how effective spatial audio generation and synthesis is brought in as well. So how do we locate a sound when we hear it? So things that are happening at a completely subconscious level. So we can think of, so I'm speaking to you. You are hearing my voice. You're hearing my squeaky shoes on this floor. And you know I'm here in the room. You know we're in a room. You know we're not outside. You know we're not in a concert hall. We're in a fairly dry room. Why is that? How is it that your brain is interpreting that beyond your vision? If you were to close your eyes, you would come to the same conclusions. So we have kind of three parts of a sound signal we can think about. So we have the direct sound. We have the path of my voice reaching your ear directly, not hitting anything else. It's just the shortest distance, my mouth to your listening, my squeaking shoes to your listening. We have early reflections. So we have my voice bouncing off the floor, then coming to your ears. My voice bouncing off the walls, off the table, coming to your ears. And these kinds of build-ups. We then at some point, the number of those bounces, those reflections, get so dense that we just call it late reverberation. So we might even think about there being late reverberation in this room, but it does exist. There is a reverberation in this room, even if we wouldn't say it's a reverberant room. This is just where the number of bounces off of all of these surfaces are starting to come together, mesh together, and come as a single sound to your ears. So none of this you think about. But this part is helping inform your brain about where I'm located in this room relative to you. This part is largely telling your brain the acoustic properties of this room. Is this a reverberant room? Is it a room? Is it outside? And this direct sound is kind of giving you that original information also about distance. So kind of the relationships to all of these also feed into those cues. So the time between this and when these different reflections start coming to you give you an idea of how big the space is, how long it takes this to fade down, what the spectral characteristics are of this compared to that direct sound. So is it, does it feel like it's a warm room or a really cold room, and so on, spectrally related. So in particular, when we're talking about the direction of a sound reaching our ears, we have two main things that or kind of the duplex theory is that there are two main cues for how our brains interpret the position of a sound. So if we have a sound, like a ubiquitous, it's very important. If you get into spatial audio, you have to decide how you want to represent the top of a person's head. This is key number one. So if you're, especially any new student starting out, if you want to start working in spatial audio, work out your personal style of how you want to produce your person, top of the head with a nose. This is key. I'm joking. So you have, these are all images just like from my PhD. It's just really important that you copy and paste the same stupid head everywhere. Becomes your life. So you have a person, top-down view of their head. You have a sound source. That sound reaches the two ears. And the differences between how that signal reaches one ear versus the other is what gives you the clue, the perceptual cue of where that sound is coming from in space. So if we have a lower frequency sound, the main cue that we're looking for, and then right now I can't even remember what lower frequency, what that cutoff threshold is between the two, but we have the intraaural time difference. So that's what this is. The ITD is the intraaural time difference. So the timing or phase difference between something reaching the left and reaching the right ear is one cue that our brain takes. So something that is slightly louder, it's going to, the same signal will be at one phase in the signal when it reaches this ear, but then it will be a different phase when it reaches the other side of your head. So that's for lower signals. For louder ones, not louder ones, higher frequency ones, we have shadowing effects of the head instead. So kind of low frequencies can kind of go around the head. You can always think about it if you hear a car with its stereo really loud going down the street, you hear the low frequencies escape more than the high frequencies. So those low frequencies are, for various acoustic engineering reasons, are escaping the car more than higher frequency ones. And part of that is kind of lower frequencies can go around larger objects. Smaller wavelengths, higher frequencies will be shadowed by the head. This head will actually stop. It will make the sound a little bit quieter on the other side. So that's the ILD, the interaural loudness difference. So ITD, ILD, those two put together, what's called duplex theory, and kind of makes up a large proportion of how we believe we understand sound localization within a space with spatial audio. So we have, those two things together. What's my next slide? So yeah, so if we're in a space then, that direct sound, its relationship, so of course then exactly all of these types of cues will then change at a different angle around the head. So a sound on that side will make one kind of signal at the ear, the other kind of signal at the ear. Sound over here would have a different relationship of the sounds being reached at each ear. And so spatial hearing, and this is a completely a learnt activity. So you learn to associate this with sounds and locations over your life. So if we're inside of a room then, we can, those early reflections that reach us can be, give us further cues as to where we're actually being located inside of that room. So we just have two different examples of how we can model that. We can either think of a sound coming from a sound source and bouncing off of the boundaries and then being received at a receiver, or we can also think of those being reflections outside of the room as well. So if we have a single sound source and we have a room boundary here, we have the delay, then we have it like we have a sound source from there and a sound source from there, and there. That's the first order reflections. If we want to do second order, it would then be reflecting those back across those boundaries as well. So these are just two ways using maths you could kind of model out the way sound, or frankly light, can be modeled as well for things inside of a room. So there's lots of ways of then modeling inside of a room where things are. So that's the kind of early reflections can get modeled in that way. Late reverberation, so that thing that gives you the feel of the color of the room. Is it a nice room to speak in? Is it a good room to play an instrument in? A lot of that comes, and what we think of consciously as the sound of a room comes from that late reverberation part. So kind of as a proportion of time, this is the thing that is most of that time, of that model of the direct early reflections, late reverberation. We spend most of our time in there. And so there's lots of ways in which we can kind of mathematically model that. We can be looking at taking a measurement from an actual room and convolving it using a very empirical approach. I really enjoy an old school way when acoustic engineers were kind of making new concert halls and such. They would make scale models and then take little tiny impulse responses in the scale model to try to see what the measurements, what the sound would be like before you build a whole building, making a perfect scale, putting a tiny microphone and a tiny sound source in it, and seeing how sound would propagate inside of it. So of course there's big money in knowing and being able to predict what the late reverberation will be like in a room. You can get through some different very math-based ways, whether you're being wave-based or geometrical, blah, blah, blah. But you then have your kind of whole class of things that you've probably interacted with the most, certainly if you've ever done kind of music production context, which is looking at statistical models and using recursive filters. So if you look at the reverb example inside of the pure data patches we've already been interacting with today, then that is a recursive filter model. So we're doing more things. Yeah. So we're doing more things than just doing delays. There's other tunings of the system and filtering that's happening, and not just simple delay lines happening. And so what's inside of the Pure Data patches for reverb is a PD implementation of FreeVerb. That's been made completely out of PD vanilla objects, which is not something I made at all. I was very happy to find someone else online had made it. I think I'm talking a little bit out of the order of my own slides. We'll come to the reference if you want to see the direct reference of the reverb there. So I think it's important to think a bit about a little bit of the history about why we care about spatial audio and how we've gotten here. I think talking a little bit back on the cultural anthropology of spatial listening. And again, I'll say all of these slides are online, so you don't have to feel too much like you have to take any great notes on this. A lot of is derived historically by recorded media. So we don't like the way we put an ambient mic in a room. It doesn't directly capture the information of us being in the room the first time. So if we ever recorded a lecture, that's not, the lecture of listening to that lecture does not have the same feeling as when you were sitting listening to that lecture the first time. There's other things kind of happening with focus and attention of being inside of that room. And so ambient mics don't sound great on their own. So when we do audio recordings, we usually use close miking. So especially for speech and speaking signals, we prefer to record things that are close mic'd. But then we don't also like listening to things without the room information. So we find that also not incredibly pleasant to listen to. And so a lot of acoustic engineering around spatial audio in the first half through mid-20th century was looking at how do you add space to recorded media. And so using things like plate reverberators, how do we get a whole bunch of delays put together in an electromechanical way to create that, that late reverberation tail in a way that is pleasant to listen to. And then I don't remember what that other one is. So here we go. Spring reverb. Thank you. Yes. So we have a plate and a spring reverb. So the sending of audio signals down something that's a resonant body, and then tapping that resonant body in order to kind of get that smeared version of the sound back. So here we go. Here's the reverb. So there's a link if you want to look at the direct link for the FreeVerb implementation. That's the filter structure. The main thing about being able to have statistical reverbs in DSP using computer code is the all-pass filter is the key element there. All-pass filters is what allows us to have reverberation. So I'm gonna jump forward. There we go. To talk first about panning and stereo panning. So we have I'm going to go back to what I was going to talk about. Sorry. So we're going to work with inertial measurement units. So inertial measurement units are devices that have multiple sensors. So we're going to have to pair up a little bit for this because we do not have enough for everybody in the room. I think we have enough for pairs, though. How many do we end up with here? So 4, 8, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Yeah, we have enough for pairs, so that's fine. So an inertial measurement unit is something that looks like this. So an IMU. So this is a particular one, has the full name there. It's a BNO055 by Bosch. The hard thing about IMUs is that they have a whole bunch of sensor data put together on a single board. That's not the hard part. The hard part is trying to figure out what to do with all that sensor data. So you have an accelerometer. So if something's moving, accelerating, or decelerating in any kind of linear fashion, a gyroscope. So accelerating, decelerating in a twisting motion. Magnetometer. So kind of either there's a magnet nearby, or if there's not a magnet nearby, where is north on in the world? Yeah, that's everything. And so putting all of that data together to then say the object is here in space with this orientation is actually really hard and really tricky. And so what is really nice about this sensor and why it costs a bit more than just getting any of those sensors separated into separate things, or even a cheaper IMU, is that it does what's called the sensor fusion on board, on chip. And so it spits out that number for us, which is really nice. And that's why I like working with this one. That and Adafruit makes breakout board for it, which is convenient. And they have a really nice library for interacting with it, which then for Arduino that I ported to being able to work with Bela. So that's why we're working with these particular boards. So, do I have another? Yeah, that's it. It's also being built off of some work out of Graz at IEM. They had a paper from a couple years ago called Mr. Head Tracker, in which they evaluated a couple different IMUs to see who had the lowest latency for doing head tracking things in particular, and this was the winner. So that's also why we're using it. And so there's link there to their GitHub and all their code on that paper as well. So why are we, sorry, let me step back. I never said, why are we working with an IMU? Why are we going to work with these little blue boards? So we care about the orientation of the head when we are working with spatial audio. We don't have to, but we will find that our audio scene will be, over headphones, will be a lot more convincing, even without using binaural, if, as we move our head, the sounds seem like they stay in the room in the same locations. So in order to know our head is being moved and how, we need a sensor in order to do that. So the IMU, and this is why the project's called Bela on your head, the IMU is on your head in order to know how your head is moving. So that's why we're working with these. So we have I think we'll pair up at the tables largely.
Should be more reasonable. So that's the kind of process. It's a little bit like long-winded, but it's the easiest way we can find it to get hold of it.
Okay. Cool, so we're just going to first, this has nothing to do with spatial audio, we're just going to make sure the IMU is happy. So if we skip to number 9 now on Bela, all we're doing is making sure the IMU is communicating with the Bela correctly, and it's outputting the hello world of all audio projects. It is making a lovely sine wave. That sine wave should change its frequency according to the rotation of the board. So you should be able to have the IMU connected, open up number 9, then to see the PD of it, it just looks like this. And it's just going to be printing out the pitch, roll, and yaw of the board, and using that to control a simple oscillator. So you don't need to do anything with this, that's just what it's doing. You should be able to run it. I can't run it because I don't have an IMU connected. Only the people with IMUs connected to their boards will be able to run this, because the first thing it's going to do is try to see if the IMU is connected. If it's not, it will just quit the whole thing. So not going to work out for you if you don't have one of the IMUs. But if you run it, it should print out things such as sensor is connected and so on. Okay, so we have IMUs working, which are the IMUs. It's always really finger crossing that the IMUs come into play. It's a little bit of extra because talking over a more complicated protocol, then the analog sensors are really simple to come in, and you already saw many examples of the signal from the analog sensors not being that great. And so the IMUs are talking over a protocol called I2C, which then if that gets messed up, then nothing works. It's even more fragile. So we'll hopefully everything will be fine, and we'll continue. So we have our IMUs. So IMU synth, all that did, why do you keep doing that? Sorry. So we have the IMUs. They are giving us orientation information. So we will, and I know this is going to be ridiculous, we're going to move to holding the IMUs on our heads and interacting with things, which will be precarious, certainly. Those with the paper circuits will have to actually put the whole thing on their head. Those with the IMUs on the cables, then you just have to put the IMU on your head. That's not so bad. So let's talk quickly about panning. So what is panning? Panning is trying to make an audio image appear to be coming from a place that a loudspeaker is not located. So we have two loudspeakers up here. If we were to play a signal just to that loudspeaker, it would sound like a sound is coming from that loudspeaker. If we play a signal to that loudspeaker, it will sound like a sound will coming from that loudspeaker. If we play a sound out of both loudspeakers, it will sound like the image is coming from directly the front, not from the sides, given your relationship to being equally located away from both of those loudspeakers. And so then if we proportionally change how much signal is being sent to one speaker versus the other, we will shift that image to sound more towards one speaker than the other. So this is just panning in its generic. Exactly what the proportion is of how much signals out of one speaker versus the other, there's different rule sets, and constant power panning is usually what gets used, but there's different ways of doing this. And so that's just kind of general stereo panning. So if we take those two loudspeakers and now they're headphones and on our head, we are going to, the same kind of rules apply, except our ears are doing something kind of funny, right? In which we kind of we can hear a sound like it's coming from one ear or coming from the other, but it kind of can pan like in this weird space inside of our heads as well, where it can we still have this stereo image of things even though you have loudspeakers on the head. So we're not talking about anything about binaural yet. We're just talking about simply changing how much of a signal, the amplitude of a signal in one ear versus the other. So what we have now for the next Bela example is going to have a stereo image that's going to try to stay constant, stay in one place. I don't remember where. We'd have to look at the code to say exactly where it's trying to stay in a single place. Then we have our IMU on our head, and it's going to try to re-pan where that sound source is according to where we're looking. So that now the sound source, if it's always supposed to be from about right here when we start, I think it's supposed to come from one ear when we start. Whenever we rotate, it should always sound like it's coming from that location. So give it a go. So you'll be wanting, actually no, it doesn't even matter that much. So give it a go. You put the IMU kind of on your head. Be gentle. Many cables will be going places. Run example number 10, and you should also be able to see directly in the example how I think actually paper circuit people, if you take off your other sensor so you only have the IMU, I think you will have less chance of something going wrong as I'm looking around. So you're fine. But I think, yeah, you took it off already. Have we been able to successfully get that to work? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move from talking about doing panning, stereo panning, to talking about working with binaural, and then what's the difference between the two. Kino, what is even up with you? Okay. So And I know the IMUs are bugging out for a couple of you, and I apologize, but at least the next example won't use the IMU, and then we can do it without the head tracking. So we're going to be moving. So now we've been just using, well, previously all morning has been mono signals that we've been listening to, so the same signal to both ears, which then when we listen to it over headphones just kind of sounds like it's in the middle of our head. Stereo panning is what we were just interacted with, which is where we have the relationship varies between the loudness, the same signal, but otherwise the loudness is the only thing changes between the left and the right ears. Binaural is meaning we're taking into account the other cues we were talking about earlier. So that ITD and the ILD, the interaural time difference, the interaural loudness difference. So we're changing not just, so kind of stereo panning is just trying to do that ILD cue. So it's just doing a loudness difference, changing the loudness between two things to make your brain think where things are supposed to be located, relying more on that. Binaural takes into account the phase difference, so that time difference, the loudness difference, and does this in a more complex way where it's also compensating for when we listen to sounds, we have these fleshy cartilage things on the sides of our heads. So question might be, why do we have these things? And what they do and why do they look weird? So they're super unique. The folds of our, so these are called pinnas. The folds of the pinnas are as unique as a fingerprint. So you could take a unique ear print. So if you want to do identity theft off the tube, off of people who leave their greasy ear prints on the sides of the central line, you can go do that. Not that there's a database of ear prints. But so what these are things for sound to bounce around before it goes in the ear canal. So sounds that come, and they're kind of directional, so that sounds that come from different directions, they go through different series of bouncings before they get into one ear versus the other that's related to exactly where in space that sound is coming from. So binaural audio is using just as a filter, it's measuring how sound bounces around an ear before it goes inside the head at a whole bunch of different locations. And so that single measurement of if a sound is just slightly to the side here, to me, the sound going to one ear, the sound going to the other ear, a recording of how that of that path, of the way it gets altered, the way the spectrum changes, the way it gets delayed and added to itself. And so we can take that signal, convolve it. Let me see if I've, yeah. So there's some text of what I've just said. Take that signal, convolving it, which just means kind of mashing it up with the sound source, will then ideally make your brain think that sound that's coming to the left and the right ear, it has all the same kinds of relationships between the left and the right ear that happens to a sound when it comes from this particular location in front of me. I think that sound is in that location in front of me, or that location behind me. So that's what binaural audio is. It's trying to capture the intricate kind of details of the way sound gets into your brain and mimic that so that it sounds like you have a sound that's outside of the head that you're listening to, like it's in real life. So there's kind of things that make that not work, such as that whole thing about all of our ears being unique. So when you're listening to binaural audio, you're listening to the world through somebody else's ears. Now, you spent your whole life with your ears and knowing the relationship between sound arriving at your head and what that means for where that sound is in space. If you pop on somebody else's ears, your brain may not agree with it. It might not know what to do with that information. And so that's a thing called HRTF selection, set selection. So maybe the particular ears, virtual ears that you're listening to, you just don't get on with. You may get on better with some than others. Lots of studies to show that. No one's really figured out a great relationship between whether you can predict if you're going to get on better with a certain set of HRTFs or not. If you hear a sound, but your eyes don't see where that sound source is coming from, your brain's going to be like, it must be behind you. I hear a thing. It sounds like it should be coming directly in front of me. My eyes say, I don't see that thing making that sound directly in front of me. it must be directly behind me, because those cues are really similar on these kind of planes of single information. So that's called head-back confusion. So head-back confusion is super common with binaural audio. And this is where head tracking comes into a big play on that. So we move our heads a lot to try to figure out where sounds are coming from, to shift the relationship to get more rich signals into our ears. And if we have head tracking, we can shift our head a little bit to try to reinforce for our brain, is that a sound that should be coming from front or back? But a lot of this also comes down to that kind of cultural anthropology part. Do you have a suspension of disbelief for that there should be a sound in front of you even though you don't see it? And this is where a lot of kind of theatrical approaches and thinking about performance and sound production has a really, really strong effect on how good your binaural audio soundscape will be. So the tech might be as whiz-bang as possible, but if the content is not there in a way that's going to make the listener believe or want to believe that they're hearing that particular soundscape, it's not going to work out. So let's, nope, wrong direction. So yeah, so the direct method for how do we take all of these, so an HRTF set might be hundreds of measurements of a sound here to my ears, a sound here to my ears, rotated, and then at different elevations as well. The direct way of making a binaural signal is to convolve that signal, so essentially multiply, filter that sound source with the HRTF for the location where it's supposed to be coming from. So what if you have two locations and you have a sound that's supposed to come in between the two locations? Kind of like you want to make a location between two speakers, make it sound like it's an image in between where you have two measurements. So there's approaches to doing that. You have to kind of consider what you're going to do in those cases. There are some fairly standard ways of doing it. But what's also really important to note is the second part. The computational load will increase with each additional sound source. So if you want to listen to one sound source, it means you have to make two convolutions, one with the left ear signal, one with the right ear signal. If you want to have three sound sources, that's going to be 3 times 2 convolutions, if they're all in different locations for where that sound source is for each HRTF. And it just scales and scales and scales. And so we can even think of as reverb is just a whole bunch of a whole bunch, hundreds, thousands of sound sources. And so you start having a really complex way of representing, of calculating out binaural signal using this direct method. Because every single sound source has to be convolved twice, one with each HRTF. What we're doing instead, and it's becoming quite popular and standardized across VR as well, is using what's called a virtual loudspeaker approach. So now instead of saying every sound source is going to get convolved with an HRTF, we kind of think back to our loudspeakers. So if I have a loudspeaker here, a loudspeaker there, I'm going to convolve an HRTF with where the right speaker would be related to me, where the left speaker would be related to me, and then I can use panning in the same way I would for doing stereo to try to make that sound source sound in between the two speakers. So this is a virtual loudspeaker. So instead of convolving each individual sound with an HRTF, I'm going to make believe that I was going to have a room like this with a series of loudspeakers, and I would send audio to those loudspeakers, and then I'd have a 3D sound immersive environment. But instead of actually taking that sound, sending it to all the loudspeakers in a room, I'm going to convolve each of those loudspeakers with the HRTF of where that loudspeaker source would be relative to me if we were in that real physical space. So loudspeakers are never used at all. That's why they're virtual loudspeakers, not actually using physical ones. But what this is doing is it's decoupling the number of sound sources with the computation it takes to create that sound field. So I now could take 20,000 different sound sources and have it be the same computational load, roughly, as just 20 sound sources. So we're using this virtual loudspeaker approach. So virtual ambisonics in particular is used a lot in, I know Google uses it for sure in their work. And so ambisonics is just a way of assigning loudspeakers in a space, deciding how, if you want to pan a sound around, maths behind it to do that. And so we have our loudspeakers, and we have an HRTF for each of the loudspeakers instead of having an HRTF for each of the sound sources. So I wanted to have it ready for you. We don't have virtual ambisonics version of this ready for you today. But hopefully that will be ready in the next couple months to run on Bela. Instead, we're going to be working with something called virtual VBAP, which is vector-based amplitude panning. So it's taking that same kind of stereo panning theory, but instead of having pairs of loudspeakers, we have triangles of loudspeakers that you can kind of tessellate to make a multidimensional sound space. And so you have this relationship. You can have an image of a sound source kind of in between these different loudspeakers. So we're doing a virtual loudspeaker approach. So we're never actually feeding the sound source signals to a loudspeaker. Instead, we're taking that loudspeaker feed that we would plug into a loudspeaker and convolving it with an HRTF according to where that sound source would, or that loudspeaker would be located relative to the listener. So this is kind of the general signal path. So we're working with 8 loudspeakers. This is what we're going to listen to. And so then we have the individual inputs get panned across our VBAP array, our virtual VBAP array. Then each of the loudspeaker feeds is convolved with its HRTF or HRIR. You can see it as well. So HRTF is the head-related transfer function. The HRIR is the head-related impulse response. They're just the time frequency inversions of each other. You can think of them as the same thing. And then we sum all of those HRTF binaural. So each of these are individual binaural signals that are just what it sounds like, the binaural signal for a single virtual loudspeaker. We sum them all together, and we get a single left-right audio signal. So what we have in Bela, which is really super exciting, is number 11. Oh, we got time. So number 11 we have a couple things that have changed. So we no longer have the output that we're working with. Instead, we're just sending out a source position, and then that source position is being fed into the C++ side that's doing all of the binaural audio stuff. That's not happening in pure data. That's happening in C++, which is all work by Rishi here, is one of my PhD students. I just added the PD hooks, but he did all of the signal processing implementation. And so what we have here is a sound that actually IMUs aren't needed, so everyone should be able to listen to this on their own Belas, number 11. And this should just be a sound source that's just rotating around you in a circle. So no head tracking at all, and this is using that virtual VBAP approach. So have a go. Actually, and then I'll just tell you, if you then have the IMUs and the IMUs are working, you also can look at the very last one, which is virtual VBAP or virtual binaural with head tracking. And that one will be like the stereo panning, but with now binaural instead. So it should stay in one place as you rotate your head. So have a play with each of those for a couple minutes, and then as we're up to time, and then we'll kind of wrap up together before having some lunch, which is outside. So yeah, so if you want to change out the sound, so for the binaural ones, you just need to put into that same, so you can drag and drop an audio file and drop it on the project. The audio file just needs to be called track1.wav, because that's what the code is looking for, a track called track1.wav. So if you want to drop in a different audio file, you just you drag and drop in track1.wav. So the audio file has to be called, you have to rename it, track1.wav, and then you can replace the sorry track1.wav and it will play that file instead. So yeah, so all of the no, not that one, this one. So all of the binaural code, all of that's up and online and open if you want to play with it. It is not very feature-rich yet. Right now, it just, I mean, it doesn't take many more lines of code to add more sound sources, but right now it just supports the one sound source. And you can set the elevation as well. But I didn't put that in the PD patch. But that's all there if you want to kind of interact with it at all. There's a direct link to the IMU synth example as well. And then in all of the VBAP stuff is the link there. It's all in the same repo that this is being hosted in, actually. It's all a project called Bela on your head. And if you're interested in the paper side, not that we did anything with the paper things today, there's tutorials for how you make all of the light sensors and stuff like that is all up online as well. If you're interested in, that's the links down at the bottom for all of that. Yeah, so I think because now I realize we're now a little bit past 1. Any questions?
It's the first time I see it. You don't want to hear all my questions.
I know it's a really long ramp in order to be able to get far enough that you can like start interacting with this. So I know it's kind of like, oh, well, now we finally can interact with the binaural audio. It only took 3 hours to get to that point. So I do apologize for that. I'm okay with if you want to play with it over kind of the lunch period. I don't know what time the next workshop is, but I think it's not for an hour.
2.
Not for 2 hours?
No.
Oh, it's at 2 o'clock. Okay. So I'm very happy if you want to even get some food and have a play, and I'll still be around with any of it. That's totally fine. You can have a play with combining some of the audio playback stuff that we were working with before, the filtering things in particular with this. You can do that. Play audio file you can't use with the binaural part because that's handled in the C part. But kind of the filters and things like that we were working with in the other PD examples, you can make a patch and use those inside of here. You could have the sensors interact with the audio in some kind of way if you'd like as well. I'm just going to throw around as well some generic feedback things if you had anything else. Oh, there were some other questionnaires I'll give to your table you guys didn't see for just general information. I'll put around these. Most of the questions you can ignore because we didn't do like a different kind of making activity, but it's just because, you know, in general, things that went well, things that you think could change, other features you would like, now that you've kind of seen the binaural code and interacted with it, what would you like to do with it? What would be useful hooks in the pure data version of the code that you would want to be able to change this parameter to the binaural audio and things like that, so that we can kind of plan as we put together and build up the library what would be of use for what you'd like to interact with. So I'll pass these around as well if there's any more. And then yeah, and I'll take those. And yeah, so there is lunch